30 AD, something like that. On the shore of the Sea of Galilee, this young rabbi shows up. And at this point, he's already got quite a reputation. He's famous. So these crowds are following him. In fact, the crowds are so big that he gets lost in the crowd. So he finds some fishermen. And he says, hey, can I borrow your boat? And we're going to push out a little ways. And he sits down in the boat. And from the shore, it forms a bit of like a natural amphitheater. So he's able to, the water carries his voice. So he's able to speak to this whole crowd at once. And after he finishes teaching, he looks at the fishermen and says, hey, I want you to do something for me. I want you to put out into deep water and put down your nets. And these professional fishermen are like, we've been fishing all night. There's no fish out there, and this is the worst possible time of day to fish, but because you say so. All right. And then when they try and bring up the net, it is so full that the boat begins to swamp, and they have to call their friends to come out, and it fills both boats so full that they're afraid it's going to sink. And Simon Peter, the fisherman, he is so caught off guard by this that he falls to the knees of Jesus and says, You got to go away from me. You don't know who I am. I'm a sinful man. But Jesus doesn't go away. He says, no, I am going to make you a fisher of men. I'm going to make you fish for people. And then we read, so they pulled up their boats on shore, left everything, and followed him. They left everything and followed him. Now, the crowds, they had literally been following Jesus around the countryside, but this is different. When Simon, Andrew, James, John, when they leave their boats, when they're leaving their family business, their only way to provide for their family, they leave everything and they follow him. And with that, Simon Peter becomes the first of 12 followers of Jesus who will be called the disciples. And this theme that starts to emerge in the Gospel of Luke here of like following Jesus, being a disciple, it appears to be central to what Jesus is up to. Like as Luke tries to convey this story, he comes back to this theme again and again, not just here, but then later in chapter 5 and again in chapter 7. He spends a long time in chapter 9 and then chapter 11, chapter 18, on and on it goes. Just a few verses after this, we're going to see Jesus stop by a tax collector's booth, look at Levi, and he's going to just say 2 words to him. Follow me. And with those 2 words, he's going to radically reshape that man's life. Not just the direction of his life, like his identity, who he is will change in that moment with 2 words. And it's not just Luke who emphasizes this. So Matthew chapter 4, Jesus sees Peter and Andrew fishing and says to them, follow me. Mark chapter 1, verse 17, follow me. John chapter 1, verse 43, follow me, follow me, follow me. All 4 gospel writers seem to think that this is the essential invitation of Jesus. Like if you want to know what Jesus is up to in the world, it can be summarized, captured in these 2 words. Follow me. And if you want to get in on what Jesus is up to in your life, then you and I, how we respond is really, really important. Like if you want to get in on what Jesus is doing and what he's offering, you need to follow Jesus. Which begs the question, what's it mean to follow Jesus? So Matt is one of my favorite people ever. I met him as a camp counselor. We were both camp counselors at this really fun camp, and just got some life-on-life time with him. And he was only a couple years older than me at the time, but he already had like traveled the globe, spoke multiple languages. He fancied himself an international man of mystery. Okay? And like so we go out for Chinese one night, and he's not like okay, he's not like happy to just order like General Tso's chicken. He like has this big conversation, brings out the chef. They're all speaking in Mandarin and gets the chef to cook something that no Americans ever asked for. That guy, yeah, that's who Matt is. So right before I'd met him, he had spent some time in Brazil. And while he was there, he was invited to attend Mass at the Metropolitan Cathedral of Brasilia, which is, I don't know Brazil, but I do know this building. It's fantastic, this architectural masterpiece. And Matt, being Matt, is like, of course I want to go to that. I've got to experience everything in life. The only problem was he didn't speak a word of Portuguese, and he had never been to Mass before. So I don't know if you know Mass, how familiar you are with it, but there's a lot of moving pieces. There's like a sit, stand, kneel, read, respond, like shake someone's hand, kiss someone on the cheek. There's moving pieces to it. Even in English, you can get confused, right? And so he's like, well, how do I know what to do? And his friends were like, it's so easy. Just whatever the guy in front of you does, you do that. He sits, you sit. He stands, you stand. He kneels, you kneel. Just follow the guy in front of you. He's like, that's it. All right, easy. So through the service, it goes through the service, and for most of the service, it works great. Like the guy in front of him stands, so he stands. Guy kneels, he kneels. Guy sits, he sits. Easy. But then at the end of the service, the priest comes forward, makes some announcement, and then the guy in front of him stands. So Matt stands. And then he hears the entire congregation burst out into laughter, and he looks around and notices, we're the only two people standing. And then as he walks out really awkwardly, he's like, what just happened? And his friends explain, well, the priest just announced a birth. Ask that the proud father please stand and be recognized. So what was Matt's problem? Matt was visiting a world he didn't know, entering a culture he didn't understand, witnessing traditions he had no basis or context for, listening to a language he did not speak. And when I come to the Gospels, sometimes I feel like Matt. I mean, Luke chapter 5, we just heard a story. It's 2,000 years old. From a fishing village that's like 6,000 miles away. This is an ancient Jewish world where people speak Aramaic, do business in Greek, pray in Hebrew, languages we don't know or speak. This is a world of peasants and farmers and rabbis and zealots and Romans and Samaritans and some wild-eyed prophet out in the wilderness screaming, repent, the kingdom of God is at hand. This is a day when the average family went hungry for 6 months out of the year. The average family buried half their children by the age of 12. Average. This is a world where blindness, leprosy, demonic possession, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So we're visiting a world that we don't know, entering a culture that is ancient and foreign, witnessing traditions we don't understand, and listening to a language we do not speak. And yet what makes this so much worse is that most of us don't even realize it. If you spent any amount of time in church, you've heard this story. Make you fishers of men. You know this story, right? The miraculous catch, Simon, Peter. You know these characters. You know this story. You know what's going on here. And if you're like me and you grew up in church, this is the stuff of there's little felt boards where you move the characters around. This is stuff of Vacation Bible Study. You've heard this story forever, which is to say, we think we know what it means. So I have to ask, do you? What exactly does it mean to follow Jesus? Does it mean that under a religious affiliation you check the box Christian? Is it a particular way of voting? Does it mean that you're raised in a Christian family or that you attend church? Or does it mean that at the end of one of the church services you raised your hand and said, I accept Jesus into my heart? So it seems to me that whatever following Jesus is and means, this is not a small thing. This is not like an incidental part. Like, this is part of the warp and woof of the entire mission and life of Jesus. It is central to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, to the way they tell the story of Jesus. They seem to think that if we want to get in on what Jesus is up to in our lives, in our world, then we need to follow Jesus. So what makes this so much more than just a historical curiosity is that this invitation, follow me, according to the scriptures, is not just an invitation to Simon and Andrew and Peter and James and John. It's to you and me. That the same Jesus who invited Simon Peter to leave everything and follow him is inviting you. Follow me. So again, I have to ask, what's that mean? So we're in this longer series, this study through the Gospel of Luke on the life and mission of Jesus, and we're going chapter by chapter through the Gospel of Luke. But today, I kind of want to press pause, not just on the series, but on our lives. Like as we go into the craziness that is the fall, I just want to press pause on like all the things you're doing, all the things you're pursuing, all the things screaming for your attention right now. And I want to give us some space to wrestle with these words, to explore them, to try and make sense of what they meant back then so that we can make sense of what they mean today, to actually hear Jesus say to you, follow me. So maybe these two little words aren't just some Bible words that we read, but maybe the same thing that happened to Simon Peter, the same thing that happened to Levi, the same thing that happened to the earliest disciples, where these two words radically reshaped the direction of their life and who they were as people. Maybe that same thing would happen to us. So let's start in Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5. We won't have time to unpack all that Luke so nicely wraps up in this story, but at least let's get a sense of the whole here. So it starts like this. One day, as Jesus was standing by the Sea of Gennesaret, which is also just the Sea of Galilee, another name for it, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. So this is at the Sea of Galilee, fishing village area near Capernaum, and we know this because traditionally the site of Tabgha is traditionally the site where this happened. It's just around the corner from Capernaum, which is the hometown of Simon Peter. And just earlier in the chapter, we know that Jesus was in Capernaum performing miracles, casting out demons, and specifically there was one older woman who had a high fever, very, very sick, very sick. And he comes in, and we read that Jesus bends over her, rebukes the fever, and it left her. She's instantly healed. She gets up and starts to serve them. And that woman just happened to be the mother-in-law of Simon Peter. So now Jesus walks out here towards the lake, and there's these big crowds, and it just happens to be right next to where Simon Peter is washing his nets. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore, and then sat down. Notice his posture. He sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down nets for a catch." And this, of course, is nonsense. Right? Simon Peter is a professional fisherman. This is what he does. He just spent the entire night fishing and caught nothing. He knows these waters as well as anyone could possibly know them. He knows fishing as well as anyone. And here's a carpenter turned rabbi who just came and gave him some fishing advice. I want you to go out and go fishing at the very worst possible time in the middle of the day when you know for a fact there's no fish out there. None of this makes sense. Simon, he kind of protests. He puts up a small protest. Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. Now, this is not just this is not just a good catch of fish. This is more than they can handle, more than they can manage. It's not just like a really good catch of fish. This is a miraculous catch of fish. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Like Simon Peter and his partners, they are caught off guard by this power and extravagant generosity, goodness of Jesus. And Simon Peter, he just crumbles under it. He realizes how unworthy he is. But Jesus won't go away. Instead, he says to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything and followed him. Now this is, of course, Jesus' plan for transforming the world. This right here is the start of how Jesus will transform all things. He will turn our world upside down. He will literally split human history in half, AD, BC, by inviting a few fishermen to follow him. That is his plan. So just imagine you were to hire like this team of elite consultants, like the really expensive kind, the kind that like drink like those like wheatgrass espresso smoothies. Yeah, those guys. They're sitting around with their glasses on, and you ask them, "Okay, here's what I want to do. In 2,000 years from now, I want to change all of human history, reshape the moral, religious, cultural world entirely, and I want billions of people to identify themselves with me." Now, I'm not quite sure what they would say you should do, but I promise you, they would not tell you to move to a remote region full of uneducated rural people and invest the bulk of your time in some fishermen. They wouldn't say that. But that's exactly what Jesus does. Jesus invited a few fishermen, a tax collector, a zealot, one guy who would betray him, and a few people that you've never even heard of to follow him. And that's how he changed the world. He chose 12 to follow him. Now, to be sure, these wouldn't be the only followers of Jesus. If you read through the Gospels, you'll see he attracts a whole cross-section from society. There's like a few religious leaders, a Roman centurion, ex-prostitutes, and loads of just normal people that you've never heard of. And later we'll see that Jesus specifically lists 72 people as his disciples, those who are following him. They're disciples, meaning learners or students of him. But he specifically chose 12 to be with him, to send out, and to have authority over the forces of evil. He chose 12 to follow him. These are the disciples. And here's where this whole thing begins to feel like I'm standing in the Cathedral of Brasilia. So I don't know about you, but have you ever seen a rabbi wandering around Chester County with a group of disciples behind him? Anyone? Anyone seen that? I have not. I've never witnessed that. In fact, outside of like church and maybe karate, I don't know that I've ever heard the word disciple used. So what's going on here? How do we put this into a context where this actually begins to make sense? How do we understand what Jesus means when he says, "Follow me"? And here's what I want to suggest today. Until we appreciate the ways in which Jesus is not unique, we can't appreciate the ways that he is. Until we appreciate the ways that Jesus is not unique, we can't appreciate the ways that he is. So much of Jesus' life was not unique. I mean, he dressed like a normal Palestinian, right? He had the robe and the sandals. He learned his dad's trade. He was trained as a carpenter, just like everyone was. They were trained in their dad's trade. He ate fish and bread and olives and drank that like nasty vinegary wine, just like everyone else. And he said his prayers, and he went to synagogues just like any good Jewish man would. And he gathered disciples just like any rabbi might. So Jesus wasn't the first rabbi to have disciples. Long before Jesus chose 12 disciples, discipleship was like this well-established institution within the Jewish culture. And that is the context that I want to appreciate here today. The Jewish tradition of discipleship. So let's get a picture of the Jewish tradition of discipleship. I was introduced to this by kind of the world's leading expert on rabbinic Judaism, which is just to say Judaism from this time period. It's a guy named Jacob Neusner, and he points us to an ancient document called the Mishnah, which is a collection of the oral traditions of Jews down through the ages. And in it, we find a chapter called Avot, which literally translates the chapter of the fathers. It's this record of ancient Jewish discipleship, the relationship between rabbis and their disciples, the fathers and their sons, Jewish language. So these fathers, they give us a glimpse of how an ancient Jewish Palestinian might have understood what it meant when Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Jesus, invited people to follow me. And here's where it starts. It starts with Moses. So Moses, he goes up on Mount Sinai, right? And there in the holy presence of God, he receives the 10 Commandments. And so he is, having been in the presence of God, experienced that, and now received this law, he comes down the mountain and his face is literally glowing. He's reflecting the glory of God. So much so that everyone's like, you got to cover that up, man. This is scaring me. So he veils it. But then he takes this law, after the glow goes down a little bit, and he hands it off to his disciple, their word, his disciple Joshua. And Joshua then is going to lead the people in how to follow this law of God. And then Joshua hands it off to the 12 elders of the tribes of Israel, these 12 elders. And then the elders then hand it off to their disciples, the judges. And then they hand it off to their disciples and their disciples and their disciples and their disciples. And on it goes. And each time, as Joshua now follows the law that was given to Moses, he doesn't literally glow, but his life is changed from the inside out. As he begins to live into this law that Moses gave him, he begins to reflect the glory of God in the world. And as the 12 elders begin to take the law that was received from Joshua, they begin to reflect the glory of God in the world, and on and on and on. So the reflected glory of God begins to spread throughout the world, generation from generation. The rabbis of Jesus' day see themselves in this great line of witnesses passing on what they had received so that their students might become like God intended them to be, in the image of God, reflecting the glory of God, reflecting the glory of God in the world. And the way that you get there, the way that you step into the life that God has called you to live, life with God, this reflected glory of God, the way that your life is transformed from the inside out, is you follow your rabbi. So in ancient Israel, follow both is and is not a metaphor. It is not a metaphor in the sense that, like, to follow your rabbi literally meant you follow your rabbi. Like, he's going over here, I'm going over here. I'm going everywhere that my rabbi goes. You literally followed your rabbi, but it's also a metaphor, and you can hear it in the Hebrew language. So one of the great metaphors in Hebrew for life is the word halak. Say this with me, halak. Halak, yeah. So this literally means to walk. One foot in front of the other, one foot in front of the other. But it comes to being this great metaphor for life. Why? Because these were a people who walked everywhere. Walking was not optional. It's not like you can drive to wait in line behind the cars to get the closest parking space everywhere. That did not exist there. Everyone walked everywhere. Everything you did in life involved walking. So walking itself, whether you're getting water, going to work, going to the market, visiting a friend, the average person would spend hours a day walking, and walking becomes a metaphor for life itself. Your way of life was referred to as how you walk. But get this. When the rabbis want to describe this law that was passed down from Moses to Joshua to the elders, and not just the law, but the practice of this law, all the collection around the law and the practice and the traditions that was passed on from Moses to Joshua to the elders, down through the rabbis to this very day, from rabbi to disciple, they describe the entirety of that as the halakha. Halakha. You can hear it, the connection. Halak, halakha. Halak, halakha. The halakha just means the walkway. That's what it literally means. We would usually translate it the way or path. So get the connection here. What's the connection between walking and all the collected religious and traditions of the Jewish faith? You see, what God gave Moses up on Sinai is not just a moral code. It's not just a religious system. It's not just something you do on the weekends. It's a different way of life. It's a life with God. This is how you do life with God. So it's like, it's what you eat and how you dress. It's how you pray and how you confess your sins and how you worship and how you treat your animals and how you treat your spouse and how you treat your parents. It's how you get rid of mold in your house. It's how you work and how you rest and how you find your identity. It is not just a moral code or legal code or some religious doctrines. It is a way of life. This is how to live life with God. And that is not something you can master in a classroom or a lecture. Yes, there's lots of content to learn, but you can't master it in that. No, this is something you have to get in on. It's not just something you get into your head. It's something you got to get into your body. You got to get it into your habits. You got to get it into your relationships. And so the way they picture this law, it's not something you learn. If you want to know the law, you have to halak the halakha. You have to walk the way. You have to walk it. That's the only way you can know it. That's the only way you can experience it. That's the only way you can get in on that. And when you do that, though, when you participate in it, when you learn it like that, then it will transform you. You will, like Moses, begin to reflect God's goodness, kindness, generosity, joy, holiness, love, justice, his glory. And this is why you need a rabbi. A rabbi is someone who is further along in the journey, and they can help you walk the way. So if you want to get in on life with God, then you need to follow your rabbi. You need to stick close to your rabbi. So there's this line in the Mishnah, again, this ancient collection of oral tradition, that I think vividly captures this. It's a quote, and so it's full of these quotes from ancient rabbis. And so Yosei ben Yozera used to say, this is a quote, "Let thy house be a meeting for the sage. Let thy house be a house of meeting for the sages." That's the rabbis. May rabbis come collecting your house and sit in the very dust of their feet and drink in their words with thirst. Drink in their words with thirst. But the line here that stands out is sit in the very dust of their feet. To sit at the feet is a technical rabbinic phrase. It refers to the relationship between a rabbi and a disciple. So when a rabbi is going to teach, he would sit. He would sit in the seat of Moses and teach the word of God to you. And this, notice, when Jesus goes out in the boat, he sits to teach the crowds. And so he's saying to a good disciple of a rabbi then is going to lower themselves even below the rabbi. He's going to sit at the feet of your rabbi. And remember, this is an ancient dusty roads, dirty, nasty dust is everywhere. So the image is that you just be covered in the dust of his feet. And that is the best place to be, at the feet of your rabbi. So it could mean that. But this phrase literally reads, powder yourself with the dust of their feet. It's an odd phrase. So some think that it's sitting, and others think that it actually refers to when you're walking on the road. As your rabbi walks, when you try and kick someone's foot as they walk, like my kids do that to me sometimes. Yeah. You're so close you could do that. You are so close walking every step behind your rabbi that the dust that kicks up from the ground is literally covering you, that you are getting powdered with the dust of your rabbi, like if you're working with drywall or flour when you're baking, that it just cakes into your skin and into your clothes, that you walk so closely behind your rabbi that you're covered in his dust. So at very least, following your rabbi in the ancient world meant proximity. It meant being with your rabbi, being very close to them. But specifically, in the first century, we see there are 4 marks of a disciple, or someone following a rabbi. Following a rabbi meant these 4 things. First, it meant you memorize the rabbi's words. So disciples were students, period. In Greek, it's mathetes, and Hebrew, Talmud, both of which mean learner or student. That's what they mean. But as we've already suggested, it's much, much more than like some knowledge-based education, but it's not less. So in the ancient world, central to their education was memorization. Classical Greek students, they had to memorize all of like Homer's Odyssey. And ancient Jewish students had to learn most of, if not all of, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Torah. To follow your rabbi meant that you drink in their words thirstily. It meant that you memorize their words, that you take it into yourself. Number 2, it meant to follow your rabbi meant to learn the rabbi's traditions and interpretations. In rabbinic language, this is called taking on your rabbi's yoke. So do you know what a yoke is? Here's a picture of a yoke. It's you place it over the neck of an ox or some type of working animal to like plow the fields. Here's an example. So this is the image. That to become a student of a rabbi, a disciple of a rabbi, to follow, meant you took on their yoke, that this was placed over you. His views of life were placed over you, and that would direct everything in your life. If you pulled against his direction, it would not go well for you. You were fully committed to doing things his way because you wore his yoke. So. If you are a disciple, if you are a disciple of a rabbi, if you're following a rabbi, you're going to ask, well, what's my rabbi's view of money? How much should I save? How much should I give away? How much should I spend? What should I spend it on? You're going to ask, like, well, what's my rabbi's view of work and Sabbath and worship and prayer and the 6 days of creation? You're going to ask, like, what's his perspective on singleness and marriage and divorce and technology and politics and forgiveness and cell phones and alcohol and abuse and sexual preference? And the Eagles. To follow your rabbi meant submitting your personal preferences to him. It meant letting his way of viewing all things become your way of viewing all things. It meant giving priority to his way of viewing all things, that he sees things the way God sees them, so I want to see things that way. Number 3, to follow a rabbi meant you imitate the rabbi's life. So when I was in seminary, I lived at this learning living community called the Veritas House. It was kind of cool, kind of weird. And so it was me and like these other young people, and it was run by this eclectic, exciting, kind of insane postmodern philosophy professor. And whenever he got excited about something, he would talk with his hands like this. And he was always excited about something. So it was always like Derrida and Foucault and Heidegger. And I'm like, yeah. And at the time, I was this new student. I was learning all these things for the first time. So I was just drinking it in, yeah. And then Jenny, at the time we were dating, and she came down to visit me. And just out of nowhere, I'm like, hey, you want to get some Tex-Mex? And she looks at me and is like, Tex-Mex? Yeah, so I had learned from Todd. I had lived with Todd. And now, unintentionally, I was imitating Todd. And that's what a disciple does. A disciple would literally, at that time, they would literally imitate everything the rabbi did. They would literally like, oh, he picks it up like this when he eats. And he speaks like this, and he raises his voice like this, or lowers it like this, or he sleeps on his side, so I'm going to sleep on my side. Like literally, they would imitate every single thing that the rabbi did. They didn't, in order to become their authentic self, they didn't follow whatever desires were in them. They knew that the way of the rabbi was the way with God. And that's how you become your authentic self, by being with God, by life with God. So they wanted to give up all of their own personal preferences and do exactly what the rabbi did. Neusner says it this way: the disciple's highest calling was to be a reflection of his rabbi. The disciple's highest calling. If I could just reflect my rabbi. Because to follow your rabbi was to imitate your rabbi. And then fourth, to follow your rabbi meant that you raised up more disciples. So when the disciple was fully trained, he became a teacher. He became a rabbi, and now it was his task to create a whole new generation of disciples who would memorize his words, learn the traditions, learn to walk the way, halak the halakha, and imitate him in doing so. So what was passed on to you, you were to entrust to reliable men who were able to teach others to do the same. Ever heard that before? Again, we aren't just talking content here. You are helping people walk a way of life with God. So these are the four main things that you see that pop out of first century Jewish discipleship. And until we appreciate the ways in which Jesus is not unique, we cannot begin to appreciate the ways in which he is unique. So a rabbi walking around ancient Palestine, followed by a group of disciples, that's not unique. Implicit to Jesus' call, follow me, is the Jewish institution of discipleship. When he says things like, walk as I walk and take my yoke upon you, he's just using Jewish discipleship language. And when the earliest Christians, when they talked about what it means to follow Jesus, they viewed it entirely in the lens of this Jewish language of discipleship. So the Apostle Paul, who was an expert in Jewish law, himself had studied under Gamaliel, his rabbi, and had learned as a disciple. He was in a rabbi discipleship relationship for years before he became a Christian. When he talks about what it means to be a Christian, what language does he use? He says, Romans chapter 4, we have to walk in the footsteps of faith. Let me translate that for you. You have to halak the halakah. That's what he's saying. You got to walk it. And then he goes on, if you read through his letters, Romans 6, we walk in newness of life. Romans 8, we do not walk according to the flesh. Romans 13, let us walk properly. 2 Corinthians 5, walk by faith, not by sight. Galatians 5, walk by the Spirit. Ephesians 4, walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. Ephesians 5, 2, walk in love. More than 35 times in his letters, the Apostle Paul will describe the Christian life as a walk. Where did he get that? He said, we are to follow Jesus the way disciples follow a rabbi. So Peter, Simon Peter, the same guy we just met in Luke chapter 5, when he writes to some Christians to encourage them because they're suffering, he says this, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He's an example. You should imitate your rabbi, and you should do what? You should follow in his steps. So suffering is not a sign that you're headed the wrong way. It's not that. Suffering is a sign that you're actually following Jesus, because when you follow your rabbi Jesus, the way of Jesus is the way of a cross. If you follow Jesus, you're walking towards a cross. The earliest Christians, what are they called before they were called Christians? The way, the halakha. And why were they called this? Because everyone looked at them and thought they were just another Jewish sect following the teachings and traditions and way of life of yet another rabbi. This one just happened to be Rabbi Yeshua. So, and to a certain extent, that's right. I mean, to a certain extent, they are just another Jewish sect following the ways of the rabbi. These followers of Jesus, they were marked by the same four things that mark all disciples. They memorized the words of the rabbi. In fact, what do you think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are? They learned the rabbi's traditions and interpretations. They were baptized like him, prayed like him, read the scriptures like him. They took his yoke upon them. In fact, Matthew chapter 11, verse 29 and 30 says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus is pulling this language directly into his teaching. They imitated the rabbi's life. They sought to imitate Jesus. They wanted to become like Jesus. In fact, later they will be called Christians, which means little Christs. They're exactly like him. They imitate his mannerisms. They do everything that Jesus did. In fact, John will go on to instruct us, whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did, which literally is walk as Jesus walked. You got to walk the same path he walked. You got to live the way of God, the way he lived the way of God. And number 4, they raised up disciples. So Jesus didn't just pour his life into 12 disciples and then it ended with them, but instead he sends them out. He says, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded. That you are to go make disciples. And he commands them, and they do. That's the book of Acts and beyond. And they make disciples who make disciples, that they take the tradition that was passed on to them and they entrust it to reliable men who are able to teach others, and on and on and on. And this goes from generation to generation to generation. And presumably, this is why you're sitting here today. someone passed it on to you too. If you are a follower of Jesus, this commandment doesn't end with you, though. It's for you. He commands you and me to get in on this, to go and make disciples. But I want you to notice how he qualifies this. He says we are to teach them to obey everything I have commanded. That Jesus wants us to make disciples, those who follow him, who walk the way he walked. And that means people who obey everything, even the parts we don't like, especially the parts we don't like. People who live it, who walk the way, who practice it, who get in on it. So you can't learn this from a book or a sermon or a classroom. You have to walk it. You have to follow Jesus. In fact, many today have become frustrated with the English language here. So all the words that we use to try and describe what we're doing right here, Christian, student, disciple, in English, they're all kind of meaningless. So Dallas Willard, and then followed by others, has suggested a new term. That what we are talking about is apprenticeship to Jesus. And he says, so like you think like a stonemason or a plumber or an electrician or a mechanic. Like, yes, there's a lot of knowledge you need to get in on that, but book knowledge is not enough. You actually have to get your hands dirty. If you want to become a master plumber or electrician, on and on, you have to follow a master for years of your life. You have to watch how they do it. You have to learn from them. You have to get in. You have to get a hang of it, a sense of it. You need to spend years of your life following someone who's mastered the field. And the same is true with the way of Jesus. If you want to get in on the life that Jesus offers, sure, you need some education, but that's not enough. You need time to be with your rabbi. You need to be with him. You need to get hands-on experience. You need to practice. You need to walk as Jesus walked. And when we see what Jesus is doing, that he's doing what other rabbis were doing, this right here, this begins to give us a more complete picture of what it means to follow Jesus. But I do want to say, I don't want to overstate the case. You and I don't know if you've noticed, we're not ancient Palestinian Jews. Huh? And Jesus is not just another rabbi. So it's going to be different. So maybe you and I were not forced to memorize the entire Gospel of Luke, for example. Maybe we should. But we don't have to. But wouldn't it be funny if someone like called themselves a follower of Jesus and rarely even read his words? Like, wouldn't it be odd if we didn't even consider his perspective on marriage, on money, on sex? Like, wouldn't you expect his followers to at least imitate some of his practices? Like prayer and meditation and solitude and silence and gathering and worship and fasting? And wouldn't you expect them to do some of that? And wouldn't you think that they would reflect at least some of his attributes, like his love and his selflessness and his forgiveness? And wouldn't it be strange if someone were to say that they were a follower of Jesus for 5, 10, 15 years and never even try to raise up more disciples? Never. So I have to ask, are you a follower of Jesus? That's a humbling question. So the Jewish rabbi relationship gives us this more complete picture of what it means to follow Jesus, but something is still missing, granted. If all we see is that Jesus is a Jewish rabbi, we're missing one little detail that kind of changes everything. Jesus didn't just claim to be yet another rabbi reflecting God's glory. He didn't just say, hey, I can show you the way. He says, I am the way. Like, I am the halakha. Like, I'm the one who met Moses on the mountain. I'm the one who gives and sustains all things. I'm God with us. I'm the image of the invisible God. I am the glory of God. I am the way. And when we begin to grasp what that means, when we begin to take in what that means, if you're anything like me or anything like Simon Peter, then something in you makes your knees give out. And you want to say, oh, get away from me. You don't know who I am. I'm a sinful man. But Jesus, he refuses to go away. He knows. He knows who you are. And he loves you anyway. And knowing you, he says, follow me. Now, how you respond to that, how you respond to that invitation is everything. So my invitation to you in this series, in this season of life as a church, is not really mine. It's his. I don't want you to follow me. I want you to follow him. So if something inside of you breaks when you hear that invitation and says, yes, like you want that. You want in on that life that Jesus offers, but it is so humbling and so scary. Join the club. You don't have to have everything figured out. You just have to take the next step. You learn by walking, and he is good. If you're just near him, he will take care of you. He will do the work for you. You just have to trust him. And that's the hard part. You have to trust him. You have to be with him. You have to walk with him. He will show you the way, and his yoke is easy, and his burden is light. He will show you a way to the deep richness of life with God. Now, if you want help figuring out what this looks like to follow Jesus, well, don't we all? But here's a starting point. On your seat, you received a little handout. And this handout has two sides. One is being with Jesus, and the other is doing what Jesus did. And this is just a very, very simplified version of what all the rabbis and disciples, they did in their day. In order to become like your rabbi, you had to be with your rabbi, and you had to do what your rabbi did. This right here is just a personal exercise to take home and reflect on, where am I at in my walk with God? Am I following Jesus? Do I want to follow Jesus? What's my next step if I want to lean into this? I want to encourage you to take that home and make that part of your time with God this week. And then second, if you feel like God's tapping you on your shoulder and you want to go deeper, I would strongly recommend you check out one of these Practicing the Way groups. We have like over 150 people now from our church going through this program, and it is great to do this in community with others as we figure out, what does it mean to walk as Jesus walked together.